The media sells a narrative of kinetic conflict, hypersonic missiles, carrier strike groups. This is a deliberate misdirection. The primary reason is not strategic, it is economic. The kinetic cost of engaging a peer adversary is no longer sustainable for a nation whose central bank is already under severe political pressure. That war is a distraction. The true vector of systemic attack is not a missile, it is silence. CSIS and USI analysts have modeled this for years. State actors are already positioned. Latvia's SAB warns of Russian cyber threats targeting the industrial control systems of Western critical infrastructure. The blueprint is simple: asymmetric leverage. Why fire a missile when severing the undersea cables that carry trillions in transactions and military commands achieves a greater result for a fraction of the cost? The objective is to create a blind Leviathan. By severing data flows and blinding satellite networks, an adversary creates a fog of war the U.S. cannot penetrate. A security alliance that, per Japan's own prime minister, would collapse during a crisis becomes a mathematical certainty when the guarantor cannot see or communicate. The security guarantee becomes an unserviceable liability. The hegemon is left powerful, but isolated and inert, a systemic solvency crisis triggered not by a bang, but by the loss of a signal. The kinetic war in Ukraine was not an act of strength. It was a liquidity event. A forced asset liquidation driven by a domestic solvency crisis. The math does not support the legacy media narrative of imperial ambition. CSIS analysis confirms the motive was defensive. Faced with staggering domestic liabilities and the political unsustainability of a prolonged, unpopular conflict, the state had a choice: execute a controlled, external burn-off of political and military capital, or face an uncontrolled systemic collapse at home. The kinetic cost, however, proved mathematically unsustainable. As detailed by CEPA, Ukraine's ability to penetrate the fog of war inflicted unacceptable losses. This weakness forced a pivot. Weakness mandates asymmetry. This is not a theory, it is a protocol. The result is a strategic shift to vectors where Russia has leverage. Latvia's SAB warns of this pivot, citing active threats to Western industrial control systems. The objective is no longer territorial gain, it is to trigger a cascading failure in the hegemon's own fragile system. This asymmetric doctrine is designed to exploit the adversary's identical vulnerability, its own solvency crisis. While the Federal Reserve navigates extreme political pressure, and security pacts like the Japan-US alliance show signs of collapse under stress, the target becomes clear. The liability is the system itself. This is the motive. When direct kinetic confrontation is a zero-sum game you cannot win, you change the calculus. You turn your enemy's complexity into a liability. A national solvency crisis becomes the launch-on warning trigger for systemic, asymmetric escalation. The math of modern conflict is now a solvency equation. According to analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, a $5 million main battle tank can be systematically disabled and liquidated by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a tactical shift. It is a fundamental inversion of the economics of lethality. The kinetic cost is no longer symmetrical. This 10,000 to 1 cost arbitrage is the core engine of asymmetric escalation. An adversary no longer needs to match a hegemon's force structure. They weaponize its balance sheet. Every high-value asset becomes a liability, a target for low-cost attrition. The objective is not to win a field battle, but to impose an unsustainable financial bleed, forcing a permanent launch-on warning spending posture that accelerates the defender's own economic collapse. This mechanism is termed the democratization of violence. The capability to project strategic destructive force, once monopolized by nation-states with trillion-dollar budgets, is now available for the price of consumer electronics. This principle extends beyond kinetic strikes to cyber vectors targeting industrial control systems, as warnings from Latvia's SAB regarding Russian threats confirm. The barrier to entry for triggering systemic disruption has been effectively zeroed out. The primary target is therefore no longer military hardware. It is financial stability. By forcing a high-cost defensive reaction against a low-cost multi-domain threat, an adversary exploits the hegemon's foundational liabilities, its debt, and the political pressure on its central bank. Every defensive action deepens the underlying solvency crisis, creating a blueprint for triggering cascading failures across security alliances without a conventional declaration of war. The primary vector for systemic risk is no longer a physical territory. It is a network topology. Regional instability, flagged in recent alerts concerning nations from South Africa to Canada, is not the source of this risk. These are merely gray zone laboratories, staging environments selected for their inherent political and economic vulnerabilities. Here, adversaries can stress test Western response protocols with plausible deniability and minimal kinetic cost. The blueprint is documented. A Latvian SAB intelligence report warns explicitly of Russian cyber threats targeting industrial control systems across Europe and the West. This is not random sabotage. According to RUSI analysis, these are low-cost reconnaissance missions to map systemic liabilities, pre-positioning digital charges on the load-bearing columns of Western infrastructure, from power grids to financial clearinghouses. The purpose of these gray zone operations is to calibrate the economic weapon. The physical damage is secondary. The primary deliverable is data on how to trigger a cascading failure that forces a solvency event. The conflict in Ukraine has served as the ultimate proof of concept, demonstrating how the fog of war can be penetrated and monetized, turning tactical events into strategic economic leverage. This asymmetric strategy targets the core financial liability of the hegemon, its overextended security guarantees and fragile political alliances. Reports indicate the pressure on the U.S. Federal Reserve is no longer purely economic. CSIS confirms every probe is designed to find the breaking point, the point where an alliance like the one with Japan over Taiwan is revealed not as a security asset, but as an unfunded liability on a collapsing balance sheet. The math is the weapon. The gray zone is the firing range. The launch on warning doctrine is not a strategy. It is a mathematical protocol born from the Cold War. The core logic is irrefutable. If an adversary's intercontinental ballistic missiles are detected, the target nation must launch its own arsenal before those assets are destroyed on the ground. Waiting for impact confirmation guarantees total kinetic annihilation. CSIS documents confirm this protocol remains a cornerstone of nuclear deterrence. This legacy protocol, however, is now the primary liability. The vector of attack has shifted from kinetic to digital. The Latvian SEAB has issued a formal warning. Russia is actively targeting the industrial control systems, or ICS, of Western critical infrastructure. This is not a theoretical threat. It is a declared blueprint for asymmetric warfare. This creates the fog of digital war, a state of weaponized uncertainty, an operational reality observed in the Ukraine conflict. An adversary does not need to launch a missile. They only need to execute a cyber attack that blinds the early warning radar and satellite network. The screens go black. In that moment, the commander is faced with a zero-sum calculation. Is the blackout a system malfunction, or is it the 5-minute precursor to impact? The launch on warning protocol removes ambiguity. It forces a launch based on the fear of inaction. The adversary exploits the defender's own security doctrine to trigger a systemic collapse, a risk that threatens to dissolve security alliances which reports indicate are already under severe strain. The next 12 months will not be defined by kinetic exchange, but by a solvency test. While strategic focus is consumed by the fog of war in Ukraine and the structural liabilities of Pacific alliances, adversaries will execute a calibration shot against a non-military, high-value economic target. Citing analysis from Latvia's SAB on Russian ICS cyber threats, the vector is established. The target will be a critical U.S. logistics node, a major port's container processing system. The event will manifest as a cascading, attribution-impossible failure, timed to coincide with a period of acute political pressure on the Federal Reserve. The objective is not destruction, but to force a liquidity crisis in the supply chain and measure the systemic response. It is a mathematical probe to measure fragility.